And, and just in a very ironic point, and I didn't know the quote that Diana was going to say there, but this is how it shows how conservation can happen in unusual ways. My family, way back in the day, used to own a farm in the Catskills on Beaverkill River. That river or that farm was purchased and protected by none other than Larry Rockefeller, who now runs the Beaverkill Lodge on Fly Fishing Lodge. So yeah, it's definitely a small world. Let's see. Yeah, let me just see. It didn't open up. There we go. There you go. Okay. Very good. Okay, let me just. Yep, everything's working. Well, thanks again for everyone for coming out to the second installment of the Southampton Land Conservation Dinner and Workshop. I see some familiar faces from last time, so I'm glad you decided to come out for more this time. Hopefully that wasn't just for the wonderful food, but that is a good reason to come out. So if you remember, for folks who were here last time, or just a brief introduction, we talked about a lot of the reasons why organizations are interested in conserving land and different types of land. Tonight, we're going to go in a little deeper. We're going to talk about the various processes for conserving land, as well as landowner options for both conserving land and managing land. So this slide is from last time. Again, just a quick reminder of what land conservation is. Oh, so we're a little high there on the projector, but you can still really see it. Legally, land conservation is legally protecting a land's natural resources. There could also be scenic and historical values included in there, but primarily what we're talking tonight is natural resources. And it's accomplished when a conservation organization or agency either acquires the land itself or acquires specific rights to the land. And again, to stress that conservation in this context, although we will be talking about current use programs like Chapter 61, it's in perpetuity, so it's forever, which is really wonderful on a lot of levels, but it means that a lot of thought needs to go into a conservation project because you're really locking your future and the land's future in to be conserved. I had this slide last time too, and again, I like to say that land conservation projects are a puzzle. At their heart, land conservation projects are really real estate deals. And although they're very unique real estate deals, the more that I think about them, there are actually a lot of similarities to actually selling a house to doing a land conservation deal. So if you own a house and you go to sell it, you have expectations. You have a time frame in mind, you have a price in mind, and then you have the house itself you're trying to sell. It has different attributes. What's the first one for real estate? Location, location, location. And then it has its amenities, how many bathrooms does it have and what have you. And then on the other side, another puzzle piece, you have the potential buyers. What's the market for a house? What's the market for a house in your area? And what's the economy like? Do they have money to be able to purchase your house? It's not all that different for a land conservation project. On the one hand, the pieces that we're trying to put together in a land conservation project is we have the landowner and what their ultimate goals and our ideas are and how do they fit in. You have the piece of land. What attributes does that land offer? Where is it located? Is it budding already conserved land? Does it have wetlands on it? Is it farmland? Then you have an array of different conservation groups out there, from private groups like land trusts to towns, municipalities, to the state, to the federal government. They all have their own interests in different types of land to conserve. They all have their own resources as well, or can tap into different resources. So those are the puzzle pieces that we try and put together in a land conservation project. What are the landowner's goals? What does the land offer? Who are the different partners who could actually do the conserving? And then another piece, again, what's the available funding out there if it's required? Or is there a tax program, for a donation that could help the landowner? And sometimes it takes a while to put together those puzzle pieces. So one thing I always tell landowners when they're talking about land conservation is time is really important. Time and patience. That's one of the main differences, I think, between selling a house and doing a land conservation project. Land conservation projects can take quite a while. I would say on average, maybe a year and a half. If you're talking about, say, an agricultural preservation restriction, which Hubbard is going to talk about, they can take up to 3 years. So it's good to, number one, get the conversation going as soon as possible if you're interested in conservation. You're not locked into anything. It's good to start gathering the information and start planning. So what happens when a landowner comes to a land trust? The first thing we do is arrange a meeting. We talk about our particular land trust, what our mission is, and really importantly, again, we discuss what are the landowner's goals for the land. Sometimes part of this is part of the estate planning process. I mentioned that in a few slides. That's really thinking ahead in terms of your land conservation. And I think it's really important that the deal doesn't necessarily have to happen now. There can be projects that take place in the future and are set up now. So we can talk a little bit about that. But really sitting down, getting out on the land, it makes a lot of sense, to get out there and actually see what the land offers. We start thinking of new options whenever we get out there and start talking with the landowners. And so what are some of the landowners' goals? Do they want to donate the land? Do they want to keep owning the land? Or do they want to sell it? There are a lot of options. Do they need to realize a certain amount of money? Could they benefit from a tax credit? Is that more important to them? What do their kids and their family members think? So those are all the things we start working through in our initial meeting with the landowner. And I put build trust in the end there. It's really important because, again, these are often long projects. And we always try and be as transparent as possible and to manage expectations when we're working with a landowner. Again, in terms of the time, in terms of what funding we think is possible, if the goals of the landowner we think are possible and they fit the programs, we really want to be upfront about that because if we move ahead with the project, we want it to have the best chance of success. So around the time that we meet with the landowner or right after we receive the call, this gets back to some of the things we talked about last time. We map the land out. We find out where the parcel is. And there's a lot of data available from the state, from the federal government. And we put together a map and we start saying, what are the different natural resource values for this property? Where is it located? Is it abutting already conserved land? Well, that's a natural partner if it is. What if it's the state? What if it's DCR or Fish and Game? They might be interested. They might be the interested conservation partner in those circumstances. The different natural resources values are tied very often to what funding is available. If you're applying to a state grant, they want to see certain maps, and there are things, I won't get into specific detail about them, but are there endangered species on it? Is it really a core habitat for species? Is it a large forest block, a large intact block of forest? Does it connect with other land? Are there prime farm soils or statewide important farm soils? Those are the criteria for the Agricultural Preservation Restriction Program. So we'll map all those out and we'll start really assessing, again, that part of the puzzle of what does the land itself offer. And then we'll start talking about conservation options with the landowner. And we'll probably already have somewhat of an idea from the initial conversation what's possible there. So again, we talked a little bit about these last time. And I won't get too much into conservation restrictions, just a little bit, because I know we have an attorney to talk about this a little bit later. But a conservation restriction is basically selling or donating the development rights to your land. Again, not to steal too much thunder in the next presentation, people often describe land ownership as a bundle of sticks. And each of those sticks is a different right. And you can take out some of those sticks and sell them or donate them. In the case of a conservation restriction, you're taking out the development rights and either selling or donating them to another organization or agency who technically extinguishes those via a legal agreement. But you still own the land and you can still do a number of things on the land. And that's really negotiated out during the time of the conservation restriction is put together. So again, I won't talk too much more about that. You can donate or sell the land. And again, there are a number of grant programs out there in terms of if you need compensation for actually selling land or selling a CR. Land trusts are pretty much experts. It's one of the reasons why we exist, of accessing those different grant programs. Towns sometimes have their own funding sources. Southampton has the Community Preservation Act, which is a huge help. It often has to be a match component for a state grant. The state grant will often, I think for Southampton, offer 62% of the value, and the rest of the value to the landowner has to come locally. State agencies sometimes have their own money, either just from the state or also combining state and federal money in terms of the APR program. So those are some of the funding sources that you can certainly tap into through either conservation restriction or a sale of land. A bargain sale is simply agreeing to take less than the appraised value for the land or the conservation restriction. And I should come right out here and say this is another important point. Be it a land trust, be it a municipality, the amount of monetary value that a landowner can get is usually capped by an appraisal. It's one of the first things done when it looks like a conservation project is going to move forward. Kestrels sometimes can help defray the costs of that first step in helping to pay for an appraisal, but pretty much that's really the rule of thumb, that when the appraisal comes in, there's really not much haggling possible. I mean, you do sometimes meet landowners who say, well, I want more. And you can try and find funding from other sources, but it gets exponentially harder because the state grant programs and just, the rules of being a nonprofit, you can't really go much higher than an appraised value. So that's really the cap. A bequest certainly is putting an agency, organization, the town in your will. So this is part of the estate planning process, saying, I want to know this land is conserved after I pass. I don't want to do anything with it now, but this is something that you could set up now. Absolutely. You can bequest the land, you can set to donate the land through your will, through a bequest. It could be a conservation restriction. It could be the land itself. So that's something you can certainly talk with an attorney about and get that set. Reserved life estate, this is getting even more particular. A life estate is basically when you sell the land to an agency or an organization, but you retain some rights to it. The best example that I can think of is a property that I worked on a couple years ago in Northampton up on the Mineral Hills. Gentleman lived in a house and his family owned forest land right next door. He sold the forest land to the city of Northampton. But right at the frontage of that forest land, his family had a garden. And they had an old sugar house there. And he said, I want to sell this land to the city. The city has money to pay for it, but I want to retain the rights to use those assets through my grandchildren. So it was written into the deed when he sold the land to the city that through till the end of the life of his grandchildren, they have the right to use those assets that were the family assets, the garden and the sugar house. So that's basically reserved life estate. You can also do that selling land with your home as well and retain a life estate to remain in your home for that time too. So there's a lot of flexibility. There's a lot of creativity possible in land conservation deals. Limited development, I have a slide of this later. Very often if, particularly the money that a landowner or, the funds the landowner is looking for can't be achieved through a grant or enough can't be achieved through a grant. It's not unusual in a land conservation project to carve out parcels from a larger piece of land, particularly for house lots. It has to be done carefully and thoughtfully, that you're not, impinging upon what the main natural resource value of the land is. But it happens actually quite a bit. You take a few house lots. We had a situation where we had a 65-acre property in West Hampton, and the 65 acres was donated to us. It's a great conservation area called the Greenberg Family Conservation Area on Southampton Road. The sisters who owned it carved out 3 house lots. They sold one to an abutter who wanted a buffer to their house, so that wasn't developed. They sold the next one to a young man who lived down the street who never thought he'd be able to find land to build a house on, and he's building a house there currently. And then the area, the 5-acre lot right next to the entrance to our conservation area, they now donated to us through one of the tax credit programs. And they're probably getting, I think, around $50,000 back through that, through the donation of that lot. So there's a lot of options there, a lot of creativity that can happen. Again, this is what I mentioned before about a conservation restriction. Again, we're going to be talking a little bit more about this. It's a very common tool used in Massachusetts. Again, as I mentioned, anywhere else in the country, these are called conservation easements. We're the only state that calls them conservation restrictions because we want to be different in Massachusetts. So the next thing, so after we meet with the landowner, we find out the goals, we kind of piece together what the overall concept for the conservation project is, and we map it out and we say, yes, this is something that we think we can move forward with, we think we can meet the landowner's goals, we're interested. In many cases, another key piece is that the community is interested in it, especially if funding needs to come locally. Having community support for the conservation project is really, really key. Again, especially when you have a Community Preservation Act and there needs to be a vote either at a city council or at a town meeting. It's important to kind of build community interest and support for the project. So one of the things that we do, again, right up front, pretty soon we do an appraisal and just say, okay, does the numbers from the appraisal match what the landowner thinks they can get? Again, either if it's a donation and there's going to be some tax rebate, or if there's going to be funding from a grant program. We develop a budget to see if it really works, and we go about finding funding. And again, those are all the things we mentioned, and securing funding. And that can take a long time. That's one of the reasons why conservation projects take a while. Particularly if you're going to a grant program, they're rarely rolling. They usually have very strict deadlines. We mostly work with the state grant programs, and you wait for that deadline to come around, and then you wait for them to get back to you 6 months later, and then they give you a number of months to close. So they're their own timelines. You're at the mercy of often the fundraising timeline. So that's another way. It's different than just selling your house. And again, that's why I mentioned just the gift of time at the bottom. Do we have time to actually fit this in from the landowner's perspective? And again, this was a project that I mentioned last time, but again, it shows the flexibility of a conservation project, or the potential flexibility. Someone who owned a family who owned 280 acres of land, the brown parcel abutted state land. The family wanted to conserve it, but they had certain goals that they wanted to meet. And when it broke out, actually it worked to break the land into different parcels. The land abutting the state land, the state was interested in buying it. So they bought it in fee. They bought the land outright, and the family was absolutely fine with that. The family cut out 2 house lots for their kids. You can see the lighter green lots on the left there. The original family homestead is in yellow. And then they donated a conservation restriction on the remaining 180 acres. So the family still remained owning all that land. But it was conserved in perpetuity, and they got a tax credit for the donation. So I think it's a great example of all the different things that could come together in a land conservation project. They're not always that complicated or have that many pieces, but we can make things happen when we need to, and especially when the land is important. So once we have the funding, we go into, if there's a conservation restriction, which there often is, drafting that. The survey, that's usually a very important part. There are costs associated with conserving land. We try and build those into the budget to get paid for. We can supply some of the money. This Municipal Community Preservation Act can provide some. The landowner often pays some as well. The survey in particular is one of the more costly things that you run into, and you need to make sure you have that budgeted out. They can run, I would say most surveys that we're dealing with are around the $8,000 range. So we try and build them into the budget, usually for the town, but it's something that needs to be considered. We go out and do a site assessment and see if there's any contamination from past uses of the property. That's very important. We do a title search and make sure the title is clean. We have gotten to the end of a project, secured state money. We're ready to close. The title came back. It turned out that the landowner we were working with didn't own the land that they were trying to sell us. They didn't know. It went back into the 1700s, and it diverged off, and we couldn't find out actually who ever owned the land. But they had been paying taxes on it, and they thought that for generations that they owned it. It's a little landlocked parcel on the Mount Holyoke Range. We do a baseline report related to the conservation restriction. That just kind of tells you what the conditions were at the time of the conservation restriction. So we know when we go and monitor that conservation restriction, if we're holding it, we know what it was when it was protected, and it needs to stay that way, other than natural processes like trees growing. So put that together. And then we go for final approvals from boards, committees, town meetings. CRs in particular have to get signed off by the Board of Selectmen. There's a lot of signatures at the end, and again, it adds time to the process. You have to, I'm doing this right now, scheduling out Concom signatures and select board signatures out months to make sure all these can get put together and close. And then we celebrate. We record the documents. Again, it's a real estate transaction. We record the documents, we exchange funds, and we're thrilled, and hopefully everyone's thrilled, and hopefully we get some good press for everybody, and everyone feels good at the end. So just getting back to the family aspect, because this is probably where a lot of you are starting right now. Land conservation, for many of you, is really a family decision. It needs to meet your goals, needs to meet your family's goals as well. So it really makes sense to start talking with family members early. Really figuring out, how this can benefit you personally. Besides, some people just want to conserve their land, and the money is the details, and that's wonderful. Not everyone can do that, and we certainly understand that, and we meet everyone where they are, and try and meet them where they are and help them achieve their goals. So again, working it through with family. Some of the things that come up, in terms of this decision, really sitting down with your family and deciding what the land really is worth to all the different family members, what it means to them, and really coming together with a plan. And really, then after that point, developing a list of questions and reaching out to conservation professionals or professionals from various areas, be they tax preparers or tax planners or attorneys. So that's really where to start. Hopefully that answered some of your questions. And again, feel free to write out questions. We'll be taking them at the end. And I will going to turn over the presentation to the next presenter, which I'm going to find out who that is right now. So next up, we have Sean Libby, who began his career as a private forester in Maine in 1996 and has been working as a service forester for the state of Massachusetts since 2008. He has his master's in forest science for the University of Maine. Welcome, Sean.
See how fast we can make this. Maybe just a little bit. Okay. So just hit next and go from here?
Yep, you can use the arrows too if you want.
All right. I'm Sean Libby. Thank you all for having me here. I am your service forester for the town of Southampton. I practice, so I'll try and keep this to 15 minutes. It's not an easy thing to do. My district is number 9. I have 10 colleagues, and we cover all 352 towns in the Commonwealth. And this is our core mission, is to provide sustainable forest management on private forest lands. I do that through 2 mechanisms, both regulatory in administering the Forest Cutting Practices Act, which is our timber harvesting regulations. And I do that also through approving forest management plans under our state's current use program, Chapter 61. My other avenue for promoting forest sustainability is the outreach events that we can do. And we do workshops for landowners like yourselves. We do workshops as well for consulting foresters and loggers. And I'm also available to come out to your property and walk with you and explore options that you have. What I can't do is the work. So this is where a consulting forester comes in. Consulting forester, consider that to be the architect of your forest management decisions, and the logger as the person on the ground that is putting forward the actual labor of getting trees out of the woods to accomplish whatever management goals you have. We promote use of private consulting foresters. They're college educated, they have a license, they have local knowledge of markets and loggers. They can conduct inventories and appraise the value of your timber. as well as creating the management plans that I'll later review and approve, and can assist in estate planning. We're all here because we value the resource we have in the Commonwealth, and we are 64% forested. 2.2 million acres of that is in private lands. That's the lion's share of our forest lands. The state is growing every minute that I stand up here, the amount of land that we own on the state side, but as of now, as of 2018, we had 592,000 acres split between DCR Forest and Parks, DCR Water Supply like Quabbin, and Department of Fish and Wildlife lands. Current use is a tax program, and it's used by the state to encourage maintenance of open space. The tax savings can be pretty significant. And the first question you want to ask yourself is, do you plan on keeping your forest forested for the foreseeable future? That makes 61 a good option for you. Withdrawal comes with a penalty unless you're not changing its use. If you decide you get into 61 and you know, this program's not for me, I don't like the look of that state guy and I don't want him on my property, I'm a Yankee. You can withdraw from the program without any penalties as long as you don't change the use. And I can get into details privately if you have any questions or concerns regarding that. So we have 3 current use programs in the state. Chapter 61 is administered by myself for your town, but it is administered by the state. Chapter 61A and 61B are administered by your town administrators, your assessing board. But if you have a management plan or plan on doing any harvesting on those lands, you are required to have a management plan. It won't be me shaking down your local farmers to get that management plan. That'll be up to your assessing boards. So I would like to highlight the tax benefits of our Chapter 61 program so you can get a sense of what's at stake here. Department of Revenue, through the Farmland Advisory Commission, comes up with valuations per acre on forested land. I believe all of Massachusetts communities actually use the average column, and this is for property east of the Connecticut River. Your land west of the Connecticut River is considered to have more valuable timber, closer to timber markets. So the fiscal year 19 tax basis is $99 an acre. So I'll go through a quick example. 20 acres, somewhere really nice and east of the Connecticut, with a high tax rate, $18.20 per thousand. Full market value for this 20 acres was $57,000+. We have our 3 programs. Chapter 61 and Chapter 61A have the same tax break, and 61B has a straight 25% of the assessed value. So here you have 20 acres. You multiply that by the per acre valuation by DOR, and then you divide that by 1,000. So you've got a mill rate to apply to your town's tax rate. And you can see that if you were just under Chapter 59, which is your straight taxes, you don't want to be involved in any program with the state, you're paying $1,000 plus on that 20 acres of backland. If you want to have open space, but you do not care to ever do any timber harvesting of any kind, you can do that under our 61B category. You can also include pasture land in 61B. You can have horse farms in 61B. You just have to have it be open space under 61B. It's a lesser reduction in taxes, but you can see the significant difference in tax that 61 and 61A can provide. If you want an easier formula, you can go onto a wonderful website through UMass Extension for forestry. It's called MassWoods, masswoods.org or .edu. We'll get there. I usually just Google it. And we have a tax calculator. You can take your last tax bill and go to the tax calculator and quickly come up with what your valuation would be under our 61 programs. So when you're considering going into a program like 61 or A or B, you have to consider what your acreage is, what your primary use for the property is. If you're a farmer and you're filing for hayfield or corn or what have you every year anyway, then it's no big deal to enroll your land in 61A. It's the same exact tax break, but 61A does require filing every year. So if you're just a forest landowner and have no reason to go to the assessor's office every year, you can just go with 61 and you only end up having to renew every 10 years. And then there's the tax basis. If you have no interest in harvesting wood at any point, you can go into the 61B and save a little less, but save nonetheless. To be eligible for 61, you have to have a minimum of 10 acres. It has to be devoted to forest growth, and it requires a 10-year management plan. At the end of that 10 years, you'll have to have that plan recertified. 61A, you can have 5 acres. It has to be devoted to agricultural use. If you had a 5-acre farm, a blueberry farm, and 5 acres of back forest land that you never touch and never going to touch, save a couple cords of firewood a year, that could be enrolled as non-productive forest land. Or if you were to harvest it, any number of acres under 61A, you are supposed to have a management plan. Under 61B, you can also have a minimum of 5 acres, and it just has to be substantially open, natural, wild condition. Like I said before, there are withdrawal penalties if you are changing the use. It is actually spiked at the time that you change the use, not from the time that you withdraw. And these can come in the form of a conveyance tax if you're in your first 10 years of the 61 program, or a rollback tax, which looks 5 years back at what you would have paid under Chapter 59 and assesses a simple interest rate on that. There's also a right of first refusal if you are to withdraw from the 61 programs and convert to another use that's not open space within 1 year. So we have other plans. Most of them have a 61 basis, but we have a forest stewardship plan, and you can get cost shared by the state or cost shared through NRCS, a federal organization, through USDA, to have that plan paid for. It includes a little bit more detail, and you can add on to even that to get join our green certification program, or have a bird habitat assessment performed on your property. Those are bigger plans. They involve a lot more work on behalf of your consulting forester, and that means cost, but the cost sharing goes up accordingly. So this is our cost share rates as of last year and this year. If you have between 10 and 36 acres, the state, and you are a first-time landowner in 61, the state will cost share up to $910 for that property. If you have 37 acres up to 500 acres, you can get additional funding, $13 an acre. This typically covers the cost of your plan. There are some foresters that will charge slightly more than the reimbursement rate, and in general, those foresters are giving you a slightly better plan than you might get otherwise. But if you don't want to pay any more than the cost share rate, find another forester. If you are to join and have a cost shared stewardship plan, this opens up you to available cost share practices from NRCS. I know coming into tonight that there had been some questions about invasive plant control. The state doesn't cost share invasive plant control, but NRCS will. If you are to access these programs for cost sharing benefits, there's a pile of federal paperwork you'll have to get through. If you're going to do a lot of invasive plant control, it's probably worth your while. And once you establish your farm and tract number with NRCS, you can use that farm and tract number to gain other cost shared practices. And if the state is out of cost share money for your plan, NRCS might have additional funding for just the planning. If they do planning, they generally want to do other habitat or other cost share practices involved. One of the common cost share practices that landowners do is establishing early successional bird habitat, and that takes place on land that where the timber might not pay its way out of the woods. So if it has a nominal timber value and you'd like to create a clear cut for bird habitat, you can get cost shared to do that practice. We have a program, Forester for the Birds. We're in conjunction with Mass Audubon, and it's through the Massachusetts Woodlands Initiative, Working Forest Initiative. If you have a plan already existing, you can add a bird habitat assessment to your management plan, and the rates are a little less than if you're having a new, or a little bit more. If you're having a little less rather if you're having a new plan, because the forester will only have to go out once. If you have an existing plan, they can cost share a little bit more money for that habitat assessment because it requires another entry into the woods by your forester. So I like to say a goal without a plan is just a wish, and I deal with plans, both cutting plans and management plans. And I'll just go quickly through what you'd expect to see in a management plan. General landowner information, who you are, what your objectives are, what you have, both described in terms of trees and species and habitat, but also mapped, and recommendations to meet your goals for the next 10 years. Here's a general front page to a management plan, and you can see we have all the different options, and so we can, the plans generally come in looking like this. And you see there's categories for green certification, for birds, for stewardship, or just a straight 61 plan. If you're doing a stewardship plan, it adds that, I think the picture had an orange and some extra cookies. That's basically in your overview, and it details local pattern of land use. It identifies adjacent conservation lands and how that might promote common conservation goals. It will go into a little bit of the history of disturbance on the property, and it'll provide you with an overview of your management summary. If you're going to get that big sandwich at the bottom of the screen with bird habitat assessment included, it'll give you an overview of what important bird habitat characteristics you have on your property, what might be missing, and what you can do to manage for birds. In a general stand description on 61 lands, you're getting an overview, overstory species and condition, regeneration species and condition, soil types, moisture, drainage, productivity, and what your desired future condition is. When you go up a level to stewardship, they're covering a lot of additional information, including invasive plants, excessive slopes. You can see the list. If you're going to go for a bird habitat assessment all the way, you'll get a further detail, including coarse woody debris, fine woody debris, leaf litter, soft mass presence. It's really a hefty plan, but it gives a landowner an awful lot of information to use to plan management in the future. Typical stand description page. Typical desired future condition. This was one that is a bird habitat plan, so it's talking about what you have for a condition, what action you can take, and what birds that it will benefit. This is an overview that you'd have in a stewardship plan, and you can see that this landowner is applying for some cost-shared activities like invasive plant control or oak regeneration, but they also have just a general harvest planned, which will be an income-producing portion. Management considerations. This is the detail of what you're going to do to accomplish the goals you have outlined in your management plan. Most people flip right to the map, and I'm a big fan of maps. It shows you, illustrates what you have on your property. Here's a professional forester's map. That one was just mine that I use as an example. And a lot of times now you'll get GPS maps. So if you want to make an informed decision, you can start by calling your service forester. You can find a licensed consulting forester either through the Mass Woods website or by calling me. I don't make recommendations, but I will give you sources for lists of people who are involved locally. I usually say call the closest 3 foresters and see who calls you back. That's So foresters are generally working in the woods for a good reason, and they're not real phonesy. So this is what we've been doing through service. Just last year, we worked with 3,000 landowners at workshops like this. Last year, the Stewardship Program was able to fund 224 different plans. Currently, we have like 500,000 acres enrolled in the 61 programs, and another a little 100,000 plus acres in just stewardship programs. And that accounts for about 24% of the eligible land base. So there's room to grow, but we've really been covering a lot of our bases. We also have some green certification program. It's been kind of set in stone. We don't have a lot of growth in that category, but we do have 129 landowners and 50,000 acres in our green cert program. Two of the biggest landowners being W.D. Coles and Hull Timberlands. If you are interested in getting a cost-shared stewardship plan, the first name and number, Michael Downey, is the coordinator for that program. A call to him will tell you whether there's available money this year or whether you need to get on a waiting list for next year. If you're interested in more information about Forester for the Birds, Allison Wright or the Mass Woodlands Institute. Allison's a service forester like myself. Melissa Patterson works with the Woodlands Institute, both of which coordinate Forestry for the Birds programming. If you'd like help through the Mass Forest Alliance in anything related to your timberlands, you can call Charlie Thompson. They're a good organization. They include landowners, foresters, and industry folk. And if you'd like information about our green certification program, Doug Hutchison, another service forester like myself, is in charge of coordinating that program. That's it. Little over.
Thank you for coming out of the woods and joining us tonight, Sean. That was great. Just to kind of reset where we stand now. So, Sean obviously just talked about Chapter 61, which really is a program meant to help land be more economical for landowners to own. So hopefully they won't necessarily sell it for development. And it makes it more economical, obviously, through accessing programs for managing the land and also reducing the property tax on the land through the program. Now we're going to switch a little bit, and we're going to talk about that one difference that Chapter 61 is not land preservation in perpetuity. It's while you have it enrolled. So we're going to switch back over to talking about land conservation in perpetuity and different type of tax benefits, income tax benefits through land conservation. So I'd like to introduce Peter Omec as our next speaker. Peter has practiced as an attorney since 18 you're not that old. 1989 in the Amherst law firm of Omec and Omec with a particular interest in tax and estate planning for family lands. He has worked extensively with landowners, the trustees of reservations, and land trusts to preserve thousands of acres of farmland and woodland. So I'm very glad to introduce Peter Omec.
And just while you're passing those around, I know that Mark's going to introduce our next speaker, but I just want to give my own personal shout out to Rich Hubbard, who is retiring from the Franklin Land Trust tonight, at midnight, I guess. Rich and I have worked together on many projects, and Mark, your mention of me practicing in the Valley since the 1800s is apropos. I think we've worked together, Rich, since my hair was brown and you had hair. So congratulations on your retirement, and all of your years of service to the Commonwealth and the Valley are just truly appreciated. We all have loved what you've done. Just about every project in this valley has Rich's fingerprints on it. So thanks, Rich. And I'm here to talk about the tax advantages of conservation restrictions and gifts of conservation land. Apologies if my speech is a little bit slurred. I just made it through a rather difficult tax season. The new tax law was really just wonderful to work with. Not. But here we go. So what do you need to do to get a tax deduction for a gift of a conservation restriction? First, you need a qualified piece of property. It has to be, you have to donate either the entire interest in the property, a remainder interest, or a restriction on the property. And Mark had up on his slide several different opportunities to make these type of gifts. You have to restrict the use of the property in perpetuity in order to preserve the conservation purpose. So just know that whatever you decide, it's permanent. So you really have to be comfortable in your decision and confident that you're not going to have second thoughts about it. It must be given to a qualified organization, could be the state, land trust, the town, all those various entities, and you have to have a conservation purpose in doing it. And the conservation restriction document generally lays out all of the various conservation purposes, why your land fits the bill. Is there a particular waterway that's protected here? Are there particular species of wildlife that are prevalent that will be protected by this conservation restriction? So it has to protect habitats, protect some historic feature in the land, or other way that it's going to have a conservation purpose. The valuation of the gift is pretty straightforward when you're making a direct gift. We get an appraisal and determine what is the full fair market value of that land that I'm going to donate to the conservation group. If you're donating a restriction, then we do a little more complex appraisal and determine what's the fair market value of the property before we place the restriction on it, and then what's the fair market value with the restriction on it. That difference is going to be your potential charitable deduction when you file your tax return for the year of the gift. There are some restrictions on how much you can deduct on your tax return. So if we have a person who is making $100,000 a year, for example, they can make a gift and a conservation gift and donate up to 50% of their adjusted gross income. So if you had a piece of property that was valued at $75,000 and you didn't make any other charitable gifts in that year, you could deduct up to $50,000 of that $75,000 donation in year one. There are carryovers, which I'll touch upon in a minute, so that you can get use of the full gift in the future. Again, the valuation is based on the highest and best use of the property, not what you're using it for now. So even though you may be farming the property or it may be just open land, the value in the appraisal is going to be based on house lots or other potential uses that would give us the highest value for the property. You have a basis in your property, which is what you paid for it, or if you acquired it through inheritance, it will be the value as of the date of your predecessor's death. And that basis is for your entire property. But it's important to note that when you give away property for conservation purposes, whether it be a direct gift or through a conservation restriction, that some of that original basis has to go with the donated property. So your basis in what you retain, the land that you keep, is reduced somewhat by the value of, or the percentage of the donated property versus the overall percentage of your property. Some people have come to me to do their tax return and said, well, this is great, I'm going to give away this property, and my basis in the remaining property still stays very high. And I have to explain that Well, yes, it does, but you have to reduce it somewhat by the basis in the donated property. You have to have a qualified appraiser to value the property. I've had a few folks come to me and say, well, you know, the assessed value of my property is this, so I should be able to get a deduction for that amount. And that's not the case. You actually have to have a qualified appraisal in order to satisfy the IRS regulations in this regard. Generally, you don't have to attach the appraisal to the tax return, but it needs to be available, and the appraiser needs to be available should the IRS audit your return to provide testimony to the IRS as to their methodology and how they justify the value that they came up with. I haven't fortunately been involved in any abusive deduction schemes, but there are penalties if you deduct too much for your property, so that's usually not a problem because you're going to hire a licensed appraiser. But there have been some situations where I've had the value questioned, and we've had to bring the appraiser in to establish that the value was appropriate. It happens very rarely, and less so in recent years, mainly because the IRS is somewhat understaffed, but it can happen. Again, going back to the deduction, it's limited to 50% of your adjusted gross income. If you can't use up the deduction in year one, there's a 15-year carryover beyond the donation year if you're doing a conservation restriction. Interestingly, the regs now say that if you donate land in perpetuity without a restriction, that you have a shorter carryover period. It's 5 years. Qualifying farmers have a larger limit. It's 100% of your adjusted gross income. So you could potentially deduct, if you made $100,000, as in my prior example, you could potentially deduct up to a $100,000 donation in year one, thus making you probably not need the carryover period. Other advantages of these conservation gifts are, as was just discussed, you can reduce the value of your property tax so that you'll have much lower property taxes in the future if you have property that perhaps wasn't under 61 or 61A previously. If you place it in a restriction, you'll now have that lower property tax value for the future. Another thing that I've noticed in a couple of examples in the last few years is that you will also reduce potentially capital gains on other property. So we have a client now who recently sold a rental property, just a home in Hadley, and her plan is to donate another property that she owns in Florida to a local conservation group down there, and that donation, again using assessed value, will offset the capital gain on her rental property here in Hadley. Won't help her on the Massachusetts side, but it'll help gain a fairly substantial federal deduction, charitable deduction, to offset whatever capital gains she might have. The other type of donation that Mark alluded to was a bargain sale, which is sort of a part gift and part sale. In other words, many of the conservation groups are not able to provide you with 100% of the value of your property in a restriction scenario. So if you are willing to take less than the full appraised value, you can still get a deduction for the difference. So if your property is appraised at $100,000, but there's only enough funding to pay you $80,000 for your restriction, you can get a charitable deduction for the $20,000 difference. And again, reduce the potential capital gain on the bargain sale element. So there are a lot of ways to reduce income taxes and offset gains in a bargain sale situation. The other thing that we don't see very often anymore, but we certainly did in years past, was an estate tax deduction. So once you have restricted your land, you have now reduced the value of it in your estate. If it's permanently restricted, when you die, the property is going to be valued at whatever that agricultural value is or restricted value is. So that in the past, when the IRS estate tax exemption was much lower, we saw a lot of people saving estate taxes by reducing the value of their land through some sort of restriction. That's not as much of an issue now because the IRS exemption from estate tax is over $11 million per spouse. So unfortunately, I don't have too many clients in that category anymore, but it would be nice. but it has helped as well on the state side. The Massachusetts estate tax exemption is $1 million. So a lot more people are at that threshold or above. So a donation of land will bring your estate down maybe under $1 million or maybe at least closer to $1 million. Massachusetts has an interesting estate tax threshold of $1 million. If you're under $1 million, you pay no estate tax and you don't have to file a return. If you're over $1 million, you pay tax on the entire amount. Even if you're at $1,010,000, you pay tax on the entire amount. So any donations you can make are beneficial. I've had a couple of clients who were right around $1 million or just above $1 million, and we've discussed either making some sort of a land donation or a cash bequest to a charitable entity at death to bring their estate below $1 million, and then they have no estate tax to worry about. So definitely something to think about. Again, on the federal side, we don't see it, but we certainly will see it more on the Massachusetts side, because that $1 million exemption doesn't seem to be increasing at all and hasn't in many years. I think that's pretty much it on the federal side. Jumping over to the state conservation land tax credit, which is an incredible program that was instituted a few years ago. It basically recognizes landowners who donate real property either outright or through the conservation restriction. It has to permanently protect land, as we've talked about. The program is funded right now for up to $2 million a year, but there is a bill that was just announced a few weeks ago, I believe, with a proposal to increase funding by $1 million a year for the next couple of years, up to $5 million. And the reason this is a great advancement, if it does go through, is that right now there's a significant backlog of projects that have applied for this credit. I believe the last time I looked, there were about 2,200 acres on the waiting list, a little under $5 million in property that is waiting for this credit. Everyone has to be certified by the state, and again, the land must have significant natural resources, and the restriction must be in the public interest, just like for a typical conservation restriction. The upside of this is that you get a tax credit for 50% of the value of your donation, up to $75,000. And so that can, if you have significant Massachusetts income tax, reduce it a lot. But even if you have very low Massachusetts income tax, this is money that they will give you back in a check. So in my handout, I note that if someone has, say, a $2,000 state tax liability, the $75,000 credit, if you have the maximum, will reduce your tax to zero for the donation year and give you a check for the difference, which is $73,000. I've only had a couple of clients fortunate enough to take advantage of this program, but it really was amazing, and it really helped these farmers to provide some capital for future improvements to the property. The difficulty is there is a significant wait list, so it's something that if you're thinking about it, you get your hat in the ring as soon as possible, because that list is growing, and hopefully as these limits increase, the wait time will shrink as well. But I think it's a really attractive program for a lot of people, and even a lot of people don't qualify for significant charitable deductions anymore on the federal side, so this is more and more attractive. And in addition, it's dollar for dollar, so it's not a deduction, it's an actual dollar for dollar credit coming back to you. So to me, it's really a much more valuable program to take advantage of if it's something that interests you. I think that the issue that we've had over the years is that this planning is not something that you want to do as an individual or as a couple. I think it's really important that you bring the family into this. I'm sure over in Southampton, it's the same as in our neck of the woods. A lot of the farms are multi-generational. You've been at it for years. You don't want to give it up. And there may be siblings or children that are involved, others that aren't, and you have difficult decisions to make. How do I be fair but not necessarily equal in passing on my estate, and how do I make sure that the farm stays in farming or the land stays forever wild the way I've always enjoyed it. And I think it's important to have a family meeting about it if you've got kids that show an interest or siblings that show an interest, and talk about some of these things. There are a lot of programs out there that can make it easier to pass the land to the next generation, to provide funding for those kids or those siblings who are not directly involved in the farm, so that some get the farm and others get cash. And we've had great success with sort of coordinating those meetings and discussing what are the advantages and disadvantages. And bring in your professionals, you know, your attorney, your accountant, financial advisors, and figure out a way to get this land preserved, because we're all here because you love the land, and so do we as professionals, and the more we can do to help you get to your goals, I think the better. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. Just to follow up with Peter's presentation, I can say we're using the state conservation land tax credit that Peter talked about at the end a lot more now. Right now, they're accepting applications for the 2020 calendar year, so that lets you know how booked up they are. I did just talk to one of the main lobbyists trying to get the funding increased. The bill has passed the House in Massachusetts, which is great. They're now working on the Senate, so if anyone is interested in doing some advocacy and calling their local state senator to encourage them to pass that bill, that would be fantastic. So now we're going to turn to who might be the man of the evening here, Rich Hubbard. Before he turns into a pumpkin at midnight, we need to get him up here. So I've certainly known Rich for a long time as well. He is currently the executive director of Franklin Land Trust for a few more hours, and an authority on farmland and open space conservation, who has negotiated conservation of more than 41,000 acres. He was Assistant Commissioner of the Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources, and for 15 years managed its agricultural preservation, the APR program for the state. So I am honored and happy to introduce Rich Hubbard tonight.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. Yes, you can tell your grandchildren and children that you saw the last presentation of Rich Hubbard while he was the executive director of the Franklin Land Trust. I'm going to keep my fingers in this stuff. Believe me, I've been doing it for too long. I'm on the Mass Land Trust Coalition board. I fully intend to stay on that board too, so I'm not going totally away. And Peter, thank you for your kind words. We've had some interesting projects together over the years, which has led to the loss of hair and addition of grayness. But so here I am, 35 years, relationship for 35 years with the Agricultural Preservation Restriction Program, both when I managed it for the state and in my work with the Land Trust. But I'm being asked in 15 minutes to tell you about something I could talk about for 2 hours. So this is really going to be a Cliff Notes version of this. And the other thing that's happened quite recently with the program too, where it makes it a little bit more tricky to talk about the program, there are a lot of changes happening with the program in terms of the Farm Bureau and some things that are being tweaked, and the federal government's more involved in the program in terms of funding than it ever used to be, which has complicated things. So I think if there's anything that you get out of this presentation tonight, I would recommend that what it is call Mark in the Kestrel Land Trust, because you shouldn't try to absorb all of this yourself tonight. And they know all the players, they know the resources. If they don't know the answers, they can get you the answers. So rely upon them to help you through this process. I think that's really important to remember. And I have a printout up here of the APR program's website. I'm not lazy, I just did it that way because, again, there's so many changes happening in the program. I didn't want to put anything out where somebody was going to call me up from Boston and say, hey, why'd you say this? You know, this is not the way it's working right now. They can't argue that it's, you know, I can say it's from your website, so that's why I put it out that way. But APR program started in 1977. Fred Winthrop, who was the Commissioner of Agriculture at the time, And he took the idea from Suffolk County, New York, on Long Island, which was the first government entity to implement what's called a purchase of development rights, or PACE, they call it sometimes, to purchase of agricultural conservation easements. 40 years ago probably. If you've ever been out on western or eastern Long Island, and there's all that beautiful farmland, that's there because there's a program out there like the Agricultural Preservation Restriction Program. So it's been around for a long time. It's conserved tens of thousands of acres across the state. There's absolutely no question that this valley would look very, very different today if it weren't for the Agricultural Preservation Restriction Program. If anyone has ever gone up to the top of Mount Sugarloaf and looked down in the valley, and if you haven't, you really need to. That's one of my favorite places on this planet. You're looking down on a lot of land that's been put under agricultural preservation restriction that would have, I know it would have houses on it today if it weren't for the APR program, because I worked on a lot of those farms down in that valley. So it's a very, very important program. And why do people do it? Why do farmers go into this? There's lots of different reasons people get into the agricultural preservation restriction program. Some cases they just flat need the money. It's a way to release equity from your land without having to put houses on it. A lot of landowners are land rich and cash poor, and it's a way to release some of that equity. In some cases, they want to expand their farms. They need the equity to be able to improve their farms, build new buildings, add new infrastructure. It's been a really important tool for that. Sometimes farmers rent a lot of land, and they want to be able to buy some of that land. And the only way they can afford to buy it is to do it through an agricultural preservation restriction, where the farm's conserved, the value of the farm comes down to its agricultural value, and they're able to purchase it. Peter mentioned estate planning. It's a very powerful estate planning tool, where if you've got 2 or 3 kids, one of them who's interested in continuing with the farm and the others who don't want to have anything to do with it, well, how do you equitably divvy up all your assets and your resources? Well, one way to do it is do an agricultural preservation restriction, take the money from that APR, distribute that to your kids who don't want to be on the farm, and hopefully then your son or daughter will be able to continue with owning the farm and continue to farming the land. So it's a very powerful estate planning tool. The process of applying is not rocket science, but again, I'm hedging a little bit right now because it is not quite as easy as it used to be in the good old days when I was managing the program. It's a little bit more complicated. For instance, it used to be a rolling application. You could apply any time of year, and now they said, no, you've got to apply by the end of June, although there's a little bit of fudging there that you can do sometimes. So that makes it a little bit more difficult to plan ahead and get into the process. As it was mentioned, it could be a 3-year process to see your funding. But the land trust can sometimes help you with that too. If you need something right away, you need money right away, don't say, oh, I'm not going to apply to the APR program. It's going to take me 3 years to see my money. The land trust can work with you to try to maybe figure out a way to get you some of that money in the meantime. But it's really important to know there's no cost or obligation to apply. If you apply to the program, the state will pay for an appraisal. They'll come out with an appraisal and put it on your table and talk with you across the kitchen table about the numbers, lay them all out in front of you, explain, and they hire really good appraisers, and explain to you why the numbers are the way they are. And if at the end of that conversation you go, you know what, it's not enough money, or you know what, I've changed my mind, that's where the conversation ends. The state's disappointed that you aren't really ready to move ahead, but that's where the conversation ends. So if you're thinking you want to do something to conserve your farm, if you think about it, there really aren't many other tools available where you can do that and realize a good portion of the equity of that farm, the value of that farm. And we're talking somewhere of 80 to 90% of the value can be, you can get that out of an agricultural preservation restriction. If you decide to move ahead, then there's a whole lot of process that you have to go through. You get into the queue. There's an agricultural preservation restriction document, which looks a little bit like the conservation restriction you've seen up here tonight, but it's obviously more tailored to agriculture and ensuring that the land remain in agriculture. In fact, it's an absolute requirement that the land remain in commercial agriculture. There's a covenant in there that says you will keep it in commercial agriculture. The 2 goals of the program at the beginning were making land available for farmers to continue to farm. They did a great, program's done a great job with that over the years. And the other thing is to make it available at an affordable price for farmers to be able to afford to purchase it. That became a little bit more tricky down the road when into the program, where used to be you strip the development rights from a piece of farmland. How could it be worth more than anything than its agricultural value? You've taken all the development value away. Well, wasn't that many years ago where all of a sudden something called estate value crept in, where there were people who were very happy to pay huge dollars for a conserved farm because it was a beautiful farm with beautiful views, and it didn't matter if they couldn't build houses all over it. As long as there was one house on that property, they were willing to pay big bucks for that property. And so the goal of affordability started to slip away, and there were farmers who were being outbid by non-farmers who just wanted to buy these properties for estates. So the program, and sometimes I hate to admit this, but came up with something called the option at agricultural value, which I came up with, which basically says if you conserve the farm and you're getting paid the difference between the fair market value of your farm based upon an appraisal and its agricultural value based upon an appraisal, and that's usually done through comparable sales of land that's already been conserved, you're getting paid that value, then the next farmer shouldn't be expected to have to pay more than its agricultural value, because you've gotten all the difference. And the only way that you can make sure that that happens is that the option at ag value is there. So when you go to sell it, after you've gotten your money out, if you go to sell it, then you can't sell it for more than when an appraiser is telling you the ag value of the property. Now that ag value can keep going up. When I first started working out here in the valley, APR land was selling for $500 an acre if you were lucky, once it was under agricultural preservation restriction. It's selling for over $10,000 an acre in some cases now out here in the valley because there's so much competition for this good land. But you can't sell it to some guy who just wants to play with it and is willing to pay millions of dollars for it because they just want a pretty farm. You have to, it's there to make sure that farmers can afford to buy it also. So how am I doing on time here? What do you got, Mark? Okay, and the other thing that'll happen if you do accept an offer from the program and you go through the process and you get in the queue, there's going to be a requirement for a survey. They'll share the cost 50-50 with you on that survey. They'll deduct 50% of the cost of that survey out of the check that you receive from them at closing. As I said, the land trusts are here to be able to help. We used to do a lot of pre-acquisitions of APRs where we go in and you're waiting for your money. It might be 2 or 3 years for the money to come. The land trust would step in, pre-acquire the agricultural preservation restriction, get you your money or some of it anyway, and then hold that restriction until the state's funding was available, at which point the land trust would flip the APR to the state. They would get their money back, and the landowner would get any money that they were still owed. That stopped happening because of federal requirements a number of years ago. It's like the program is humming along, and the feds always seem to figure out a way to break something that doesn't need fixing. But the Farm Bill recently came out. There's new language in the Farm Bill that will hopefully make it easier for land trusts to start to do that again. There's a lot of very active group of people who are looking at that whole issue. This is a national, most every state now has a program similar to the APR program. So a lot of people are really looking at how can we make this work again better. The option has been very controversial over the years, mainly because of the way it's being implemented by the state. There are new regulations that are coming out soon to hopefully take care of that. So it's a great program. It was mentioned earlier, have this a conversation with your kids about this. If you're thinking about wanting to do something with your land, don't assume your kids aren't on board with this. I have three sisters, and my sisters and I begged my parents to conserve their farm in Dudley. We didn't want to have to deal with it. We didn't want to have to be the ones to make the decision to do something bad to that farm. And so they conserved it many, many years ago, and we're so thankful they did. And so, again, you need to have that conversation. But you're leaving a wonderful legacy for people, for all of us, if you decide to go down the road of conservation. So, again, thank you for having me tonight.
Thank you, Rich. And just a reminder to everyone out in the audience, if you're coming up with questions after these presenters, feel free to write them again on a little index cards at your table, and we'll be collecting them at the end and answering. Rich is coming up for an encore now. So we're going to talk a little bit more now about what are those odd beasts called conservation restrictions. Again, it's a very frequently used tool in Massachusetts, but they're certainly very specific and very unusual from real estate transactions that most of us have undertaken if we're just regular landowners. So I want to welcome Rebecca Tybalt. Is that how to pronounce your name? Tebow. Okay, sorry about that. An attorney who has been a transactional attorney for 6 years with Doherty, Wallace, Pillsbury, and Murphy, with offices in Springfield and Northampton. She advises individuals, businesses, municipalities, and schools on a broad range of legal matters. She has worked on behalf of land trusts and individual landowners on matters involving real property, including zoning and environmental issues, and conservation restrictions. So welcome, Rebecca.
Oh, I think it fell. Oh, earlier. That's mine. Ain't even here. Yeah. So make sure. Thank you. Hi, so thank you for having me. Thank you to Diana and Cindy for inviting me. As Mark said, I'm an attorney. I practice in Springfield and Northampton. And I just want to give you an overview of conservation restrictions tonight. So my brief agenda is just identifying what is a conservation restriction, and then I'll talk a little bit about the mechanics and process of them. So helping you identify your reasons and purpose for doing one, identify the potential holders of a conservation restriction, the details that go into it, you know, the restriction itself, which is the legal instrument, the underlying documents like the survey, the management plans, and some of the approvals that might be needed. So Mark had talked a little bit about this, but you know, I want to detour first and just talk about the fact that when you own property, it's not just a thing and you either own it or you don't. It's referred to as you having a bundle of rights or a bundle of sticks in terms of your ownership of property. And really you can, so you have different rights that accompany that. So you have the right to possess it, you have the right to use it as you see fit, the right to manage it, to the income, and to devise it or pass it on to someone or sell it. The other unique feature is that there's an absence of a term. So unlike other contracts or things like that that have a set time period, you own it for as long as you're around, and then it goes elsewhere depending on the laws of intestacy or if you have a will or other documents. But the thing to keep in mind is that these rights are not without limits. So, I mean, you're all aware of this. The city can, or town in this case, can impose zoning requirements on you. So you can't do anything you want with your property. You're subject to zoning laws. You can own property and others can also have rights to it. You can license a neighbor to walk across a certain pathway to access something in the property. You probably all, well, I don't know about all of you, but many of you probably have had a mortgage at some point in your life, and that really gives the lender a right to the property too, even though you still own it. So none of the sticks of ownership that, even if you give them away, they don't deprive you of that ownership right. You still own the property. A conservation restriction, getting out of that kind of theoretical conversation and a little more practical. So a conservation restriction is the same thing as a conservation easement, and that is really just one stick in that bundle of rights you have. A conservation restriction is a legal instrument between the owner of the real property and another that prohibits certain acts and uses while allowing other acts and uses. And the goal is to permanently protect the conservation values that are on the land, which are protected in perpetuity. They allow you, a conservation restriction allows you to still own the property. The restrictions imposed by the conservation restriction, you've heard many times tonight, in perpetuity, in perpetuity. So that means forever. And the conservation restrictions will pass to whoever owns the land next, all future owners of the land. The other thing about a conservation restriction is that it allows the holder of the restriction to enforce its rights against the landowner, against you or whoever the landowner is at the time. In terms of kind of steps for a conservation restriction, one thing I think you've heard from Peter and Mark, and really everyone tonight, is you want to identify what your interests are in protecting the land. You know, do you think your land is valuable because of the hiking possibilities or the public access, the scenic views? And some of this stuff will be supported by the state maps that are available online to show you what kind of, if there's endangered species, protected habitat there, if there is a watershed or waterway protection. One thing I just wanted to highlight is that if you have heirs that have different goals for the land, that might, and I know there's been a lot of emphasis on talking with your family, and that's important, but the decision is yours. And if you want to conserve the land and you know your heirs don't, say, you know, you have a niece and that's the next person in line and you know she would sell that property in a second for development, that might be a reason why you want to put it under a conservation restriction. You also want to think about the rights that you want to maintain. You know, do you need to maintain a building or a home that's already on the land? Creating an additional building lot, we've heard a little bit about that tonight. Do you want to still farm the land? Hunting, I know, so I live in Northampton and there's been an issue with a conservation restriction out there where I think you might be able to speak better to this, Rich, but did they not address hunting in the original restriction that went on? And now people want to hunt, and some people are opposed, and some people aren't.
Well, the tricky part, too, with hunting is if there's a hunter on your property and says no hunting in your CR, they're going to call you up and say, get the hunter off the property. So we always tell people you can't really put no hunting in your CRs because you're the ones who are going to be doing the hunters off.
That's really interesting. And one thing I noticed is that in the new conservation restriction application, it specifically asks if hunting is allowed, and that might be a change from former applications that go to the state. But that's just something you might want to think about if that's a right you want to specifically maintain, farming, composting, other current uses. The next step would be to identify, all right, who might hold this conservation restriction? And I think as a landowner, you would want to think about this from really two perspectives. Your perspective, and then it helps to think about it from the qualified organization's perspective, the one that would hold the conservation restriction, to see if really you can come to the same goals. So one thing to think about is, well, who operates in Southampton? Qualified organizations like a town, they could hold a conservation restriction, but also the land trust. But the land trusts tend to be, I think they all are regionally based, and so depending on what their mission statement is, it's not like you're going to have a land trust based in Boston that would hold your conservation restriction. So you're limited in that respect in terms of what land trusts are available to you. Look at the mission statement of the land trust. Does it align with your mission and your goals? look at their history of stewardship of other properties. Do you like what they do with the other properties and how they maintain them? Will the holder of the conservation restriction accommodate your requirements? You know, those rights that you want to maintain, will they accommodate those and allow them to keep happening? And consideration, so can they afford your asking price? And something to kind of always keep in mind in terms of this is, are you willing to compromise on what that price is? It might not be the full appraisal value. There might be funding issues that come up that maybe you would have to lower the value if you're selling them the conservation restriction as opposed to donating it, for example. And it sounds to me like you may have talked about in a previous presentation, or heard about in a previous presentation, just some things to think about from the qualified organization's perspective. So I won't talk about these too much, but, and Mark actually alluded to some of them earlier in terms of, you know, what conservation values does the land offer? The land trust is going to be interested, or the qualified organization is going to be interested in that. They're going to be interested if the property borders other bigger conserved lands, or maybe it would form a corridor between two conserved lands. So those are just some other things to think about. You know, what are their funding concerns? Oh, and just to go back, I don't know if you've talked about this in the past, but when I say conservation values, they're really specific values that are, when I talk about a conservation restriction, it is a legal instrument, it's a legal document, and the state actually, through their offices, puts out a model or a template conservation restriction, which makes it a lot easier for the attorneys. And also just easier for the parties negotiating it, because it takes a lot of the back and forth out of it, and it really allows the parties to focus on, you know, this is what we want to allow, this is what we want to restrict the use of, and these are really the underlying reasons for doing so, and this is the value of the property. And so when we talk about conservation values, there are very specific ones that are addressed. Open space protection, floodplain protection, wildlife habitat, public access, items like that, soil protection. And so moving on to the transaction documents and steps, ultimately the conservation restriction, that legal instrument, that will get recorded in the registry of deeds. You know, it's an easement, and like, I guess not every other easement, but like some other easements that might attach to your property, they are recorded in the registry so anyone can see what other people have rights to your property. They are, I know everyone has said they are in perpetuity, but there actually is a process for unwinding them. I've only been practicing 6 years. I've never seen it done. I've never heard of it being undone, but I think everyone just reiterates that they are in perpetuity because they are extremely difficult to unwind. And so that's why you want to give it some thought before actually pursuing and going through with a conservation restriction. One thing I recommend is that you get your own legal counsel when doing one. I think so I've worked on behalf of a land trust before in doing these, and they really do a lot of the heavy lifting. But I think it's important that everyone be on the same page. I mean, it is a relationship, it's a long-term relationship, and you want to make sure everyone's on the same page going into it. And so it helps even if your attorney is not going to be doing the bulk of the drafting or of the legal documents, that you have someone that can read these documents and make sure that your interests are protected and at least well represented in the documentation. As I said before, it is based on the state's model conservation restriction. The additional items that are required are items like a survey, which, as Mark mentioned, can be a decent cost, especially depending on the size of the property, a meets and bounds legal description, identification of the conservation land values, baseline documentation reports, a title search to make sure that not only that you own the land, but what other rights might other people have to the land. And so these might be some old water rights that your neighbor down the road has the right to pass on your land to get to a stream and to use the water that comes from that stream. That might result from that. And the holder of the conservation restriction will need to know about these to determine, okay, are we going to continue to, are we okay with that, or do we want to somehow get rid of that easement that's on the property, which, you know, might be possible depending on who holds it. Excuse me. And so in terms of these other additional documentation, the parties may share costs on this. As the landowner, you might have to pay for certain things. As the land trust or other qualified organization, they may be willing to pay for things. But that's just something to keep in mind up front. There are timing issues to think about. If there is a large amount of fundraising that will need to happen in order for the qualified organization to purchase your conservation restriction, you know, will that happen in time? Are there grants? Did they apply for grants? And is there a time by when the money has to be used? Approvals by others. You have the land trust or qualified organization board of directors that will have to approve it. Hopefully that's not a big issue, but sometimes it can be hard getting people's signatures on documents. You'll need the town's approval. The Secretary of Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs is, unless a state agency holds the conservation restriction, the secretary basically has to sign off on every CR that comes before it. And with respect to a town, you'll need either the Board of Selectmen or town meeting approval, whether or not there are town funds. So that's just something else to think about because that can affect timing. And I think that's all I have for conservation restrictions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Now we have our last presenters for the evening. Folks that I'm sure most of you in the audience know, Bob and Cheryl Fletcher. I was really happy that I saw you, I believe, I think it was a Big Y commercial on TV a while ago. And I said to my son, hey, I know them. And I thought my son would get really excited that I knew celebrities. And then it turned out that he had been out to their farm on a class trip pumpkin picking. He goes, I know her. She's the one with the pumpkin sweatshirt. So Bob and Cheryl Fletcher operate Fletcher Farm, the last remaining dairy farm in Southampton, comprised of 100 acres under the state's APR program. They purchased the farm in 1990, and their herd now includes 175 registered Holstein and Jersey cows. Their farm is diversified and multi-generational, with the next generation working alongside Bob. So I am very happy to introduce Bob and Cheryl.
So we took the long way here. We're still considered the newbies in town because we've only been here for 30 years. So we remember when we first came out here and we had breakfast at Chad's to look at the farm. and every head in the place turned to look at who these people were from Boston. So we laugh often, but folks will still come to the stand and say, we have a Boston accent, or I have the Boston accent. But we're proud to call Southampton home, and we're really excited about talks like this because obviously we are very committed to open space in town. We do lots of activities for dairy promotion and for overall ag promotion. And so I can't thank Diana and Cindy enough for hosting this and for applying for the neighborhood grant. And it starts the conversation. And I think we've really seen the town's folks. We were involved pretty early on in being interviewed for the master planning report. And so we're really excited about what I think is a new excitement about what we want Southampton to look like Barry alluded to at the last meeting. And so we are an APR farm, and we would not be here without our friend Rich Hubbard. He's one of the properties that that he worked on. And so we actually had 2 purchases through APR. It was the main farm and then the Zipta farm. We purchased that some years later, a parcel on Route 10. So the APR program to us is very important. We wouldn't be here without the farm being under APR. And so we are real proponents of it. Rich is right. There are lots of challenges with APR. We're very outspoken. We've gone to some of the hearings to try to help improve, Charlie's nodding, to improve some of the regulations on the APR program. But if you're considering it, reach out to those folks. The website's very good. There are some folks in the Amherst office is moving to Springfield, but Melissa Adams is fabulous. We've worked with her with different projects. There are some really terrific people there. You just have to get to the right folks and engage with them. So also we wanted to thank Mark because several years ago, Mark and Lee from Kestrel came out to the farm and said, we want to become more involved in Southampton, and we don't know all these farms, so can you sit with us? And Lee Haffett sat with us on a very hot day with lots of maps and said, would you folks put up one of the signs to say that the farm is protected? And so even though Kestrel didn't help protect that farm, if you drive by our property, we have very proudly 2 of the Kestrel signs up. And now Grindstone does, and a couple of other properties in town. And people notice it. As soon as we put it up, people said, I didn't know the farm was protected. And so we really, really want to support these programs. The land trust, we have friends that they couldn't be farming without the land trusts. And we do have Next Generation. And Bob is so lucky to have Next Generation working. And so, you know, obviously, we'd like to be able to add to the farm because we've expanded. Go ahead.
Yeah, land is always at a premium. So I will say I am a real fan of the APR program. I think it did exactly what it was intended to do when we were young people looking to purchase a farm. I can tell you that we saw Rich at the beginning of his career, and it's pretty cool to see him as he's retiring. Over the years, I think Rich and I have probably had 1,000 phone calls back and forth just to someone to turn to for advice on these kind of things. And I would probably tell anybody who's considering doing an APR, if you want to see the lands stay open, it's the way to go.
We also attended a conference recently at Hampshire College, and some of it was on farm succession planning, which we are trying to figure out, but a lot of it was also too in terms of if families don't have the next generation to work the farm, there are some great land trusts and some programs about matching, Mark, you were there too, about the Land is Good folks, about matching some of the younger farmers with retiring folks. There were a couple sitting with us that said they have no one in their family to take on the farm, and that they didn't know what to do with their farm. And so and they were asking questions, how do we get a young farmer to rent and to see if it's a good fit? And so there are lots of great programs on the web, and there are some really great, reach out to Mark or reach out to Franklin Land Trust, because they're in our backyard, and you can do it. I mean, I think what we just achieved with Glendale Road is just something to be so proud of. The conservation land, we have the lease with the town. Without that land, we wouldn't be able to feed the cows. So we don't want Southampton to be all built up, and I think you all know that, and I think you're all here because you all share the same vision that we do. But there's money out there, and there are ways to do it, and so I think in the Valley we have great resources to reach out, and the APR program, even though it's had some bumps in the roads, I still think the intent is good, and I think that they'll figure it out with Farm Bureau's help and some other folks and the landowners contributing. They'll figure it out. So,
Sounds good.
is that good? I know it's not 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Bob and Cheryl. I have to really say, thinking back to the meetings with landowners like the Fletchers, I mean, I'm blessed. I mean, being able to do what I do for a living is just a wonderful thing. But one of the parts that's so fulfilling, besides protecting the land, is working with people like the Fletchers. I just meet such wonderful people throughout my job. So thank you very much for speaking. And if there are any other farmers in the area with preserved farmland, we're happy to give you signs. They're actually not Kestrel-specific signs. They're through an organization called the Forever Farmland Initiative that we run, but it's really a partnership that involves land trusts, the state, and everything. And we're happy to get those out and put them on your properties if they're protected. So again, thank you for everyone coming out tonight. We're going to field questions now. So sure. Or we can stand here, whichever. So feel free again to write questions out, either pass them in or write them out now on cards, and we'll. Okay, and we have the evaluation forms passed out as well. So if you could fill those out, that'd be wonderful.